Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by viewers like you.
This week on New Mexico in Focus, closing the partisan divide. Former Senator Jeff Bingaman shares his insights on the growing political rift in Congress and across the country.
A majority wants to tone down the drama and the conflict and work on the problems that affect them.
And how lawmakers could address our state's problems with alcohol in the upcoming legislative session. New Mexico in Focus starts now. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm your host, Gene Grant. We're already halfway through December, and that means we're starting to look ahead to 2023. In just over 30 days, lawmakers will meet for the start of a 60-day legislative session where we're expecting action on issues like abortion, rent stabilization, and gun control, among others. In less than 15 minutes, I speak with a panel of experts about the potential legislative changes that could solve New Mexico's deadly problem with alcohol. We're also looking ahead to a new year in policymaking in Washington. With a divided Congress, there are sure to be partisan conflicts. In less than 30 minutes, senior producer Lou DeVizio speaks with former Senator Jeff Bingaman about navigating the potential gridlock on Capitol Hill. There will surely be big decisions in the new year on the war in Ukraine. At the bottom of the hour, Lou sits down with a journalist and filmmaker with ties to New Mexico who spent months on the front lines there. He tells us why he thinks the Ukrainian people have been so effective in holding off Russian advances. Now, one of New Mexico's biggest issues in 2022, of course, was our historic wildfire season. The two largest fires in state history burned hundreds of thousands of acres, and looking ahead to 2023, state and federal officials are working to make sure that doesn't happen again. Our land senior producer Laura Paskus sits down with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham to ask about the state's approach to 2023's fire season and our other pressing environmental concern, drought.
Thank you, Governor, for being here in the studio today.
Thank you, Laura. I'm delighted to be here.
4 years ago in 2018, scientists said we had about a decade to get to net zero emissions to avert catastrophic impacts from climate change. We're already seeing catastrophic impacts. Your administration has taken strides on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas industry in particular. Is that enough?
It is at a very important start, but no, we have to do everything. And I think that's been part of the dilemma, is that we've spent so much time trying to figure out, one thing. We are in a crisis. Climate change is real. We really have passed. Scientists, that threshold, were telling everyday Americans and reporting to Congress in the 60s that we were in trouble, just in the context of using gasoline and the number of cars on the road in the 60s. This is how we ended up with, smog reductions, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they made a huge difference, but we focused on one thing in one way in a couple of states in particular that had large population centers and a lot of driving, like California and Los Angeles. We didn't think about this as a national and international agenda. So I do think we are now clear that it is an international agenda and that the entire globe is going to have to do this on every single front. So the methane rules and the no flaring requirements, even making sure that we're recycling water, that we want renewable energy, not diesel engines, powering our wells, and all of the work going on at each drill site, closing up abandoned wells. All of these and more are critical for making sure that we're reducing and minimizing all of our emissions in oil and gas.
In addition to contributing to climate change and causing environmental and public health impacts, the oil and gas industry does also boost the economy. And I'm curious, with this big budget surplus we have, what money can sustainably be put into reducing emissions, cleaning up that industry, and really making sure that communities are able to deal with an increasingly challenging future?
It's a really important topic because we have a tendency to really ask for accountability and innovation money in state government, in the environment department and the other department that's involved in oil and gas oversight is the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. And given both record revenues and that we need to have not just these balances, there's no balances when we're talking about environmental protections, right? We can have enough energy to meet our needs and export. And we don't have to sacrifice all of our environmental protections, particularly at the site or the source, where typically we have rural communities who, without our support, aren't going to get attention to those public health issues. And they deserve it and require it both. So here, in the same way we did early childhood, set up funds that don't have to be relitigated every year, that allow us to make real-time investments into these communities in particular. And we did that with the Energy Transition Act. Right? We said, as we do this transition and we move from coal-fired plants, we're going to have job issues and economic issues. There are impacts. And to say that there aren't means that we're not dealing with, right, lifting up in its entirety these communities. So we put 40 million, 20 million directly to workers, 20 million that goes to the community to think about their economic futures. So you can clean up, you can do more air quality monitoring, we can make sure that our methane monitoring innovation is the best in the world, we can put those jobs there. We want to be the first state in the nation to have, you get alerts on your cell phone when there's and we're in process, so that you'll know where a methane leak is, and you'll also know how long it took us to get it fixed and who's responsible, so that you have that kind of transparency. You want to empower a local community, tell them what's happening in their backyard. That's real empowerment. And we have folks who are willing to help us with that. I mean, I do. It'll sound like it doesn't go together, but in fact, a lot of that innovation is happening in this industry itself. And while I want, the objective review, I need that innovation. And it's powerful in this space. Big funds, lasts more than one fiscal cycle, and it really identifies that we're paying attention particularly to these communities, and we're cleaning up while we're in these transitions. And I'm really excited about that. And all of our economic sectors, Laura, are overperforming. And they're going to need to, because when more than 50% of your revenue is coming from one energy sector, you have to think about very meaningful ways, in addition to the renewable energy sector, but other economic sectors that get you there. And we're showcasing that can be done. It's not an overnight enterprise, but it's the right set of investments that really do finally resolve. You have to diversify your economy. That makes us greener and cleaner and safer. And while you do that, you need to put funds together that will last, right? Legacy funds that deal with legacy pollution, that are really clear about protecting New Mexicans now and well into the future.
Where does climate change and water planning fit on your agenda in terms of nudging the state legislature next year?
If we don't have water, there isn't anything we can do. We have to, wherever the funding gaps are, again, as I talked about the fires, the state has an opportunity. I mean, these are once in a lifetime sets of opportunities. We need to take them. The Water Conservation Fund and the Interstate Stream Commission are examples of forward thinking in former Democratic administrations, that you can't wait a year when you need water infrastructure money, right? When people need water, they need it. So that was really, back then, a very creative way to create a fund and to put water out. But it's small, and the way in which they replenish that fund is also too small to deal with our rapidly changing environment and our much hotter, drier environment. That is not going to stop. And I hear New Mexicans all the time now say, these are record rainfalls. It's been a productive monsoon season. But if you think this season is the biggest monsoon season ever, not true. And if you think that this was enough to eradicate decades of aridification here, also not enough. And it's not just happening here, it's happening everywhere. And the West is particularly impacted, which means where we get other water isn't coming to us. We have to put sizable resources into funds that allow us to, in real time, invest strategies that are developed by state and by tech and by the labs and by our own state engineer, and deploy them in real time. Legislature should set those parameters in a fund and then give us the fund and make sure that we're allocating all the time. But I also want this session to be about healthcare delivery and behavioral health and education and public safety. And we've planted the seeds and our garden is growing. But none of that is mature. And to stop doing those investments today would be a disaster for a state that still needs so much in those areas. So I have bold and big plans for this upcoming legislative session, where I think by the time we're in session, if I'm lucky enough to be in that position again, we'll have $4 billion to save, to invest, and to utilize in meaningful ways to solve whole problems, not to sort of nibble around the edges. It's an incredible, exciting time for New Mexico. It is.
So I'm curious, climate change touches on all of our lives and makes existing challenges harder, even behavioral health care or any kind of challenge that we face in New Mexico is exacerbated by climate change. Yet it isn't something that climbs to the top of many people's priorities or even political conversations. And I'm curious if you think that is going to change in our lifetime.
I have to believe it's going to change in our lifetime because there's not an option. I think that what we don't say out loud, so I'm going to say it out loud. We're already surpassing the time frame for minimizing or eliminating what many scientists would identify as cataclysmic, catastrophic problems. These wildfires are an indication. These hurricanes and flooding, these are all significant issues that aren't going to stop. They're just going to get worse. Rising sea levels and, frankly, all of the melting of our glaciers are significant issues, and even the permafrost aspects are significant public health issues that I think people aren't paying attention to, in terms of we're now exposed to things that have been locked in a frozen tundra that, like COVID, can pose incredibly significant infectious disease and disease public health issues that are going to require real attention. That's past. Now we have to have sufficient resources to protect people around the globe, to deal with famine, having the ability to have enough water and to grow enough food, to really think about how we shift our agricultural practices. Same in New Mexico. We've got several million, tens of millions out in grants to think about how we do ag differently and how we grow more food and make it more readily available to New Mexicans. All of that has to shift right now. I think the fact that we have $370 billion in a brand new piece of federal legislation is testament to the fact that the conversation hasn't just shifted. The investments that cause us to do things differently so that my grandchild has the opportunity to be outside and to live where she chooses in a world that's fast approaching, right, that jumping off a cliff situation. I'm feeling much more confident. And I don't want to minimize how tough it's going to be all around the world. But it's why New Mexico needs to keep leading. And I have every intention of doing that in every possible way.
Well, thank you, Governor, for joining me. I appreciate it.
It's been lovely, Laura. Thank you very much. And thank you for caring about our planet.
The House will be controlled by Republicans in the new Congress. It begins in January. And of course, the Democrats will continue to control the Senate and the White House. So in the past, that's not been a good recipe for making progress. And I fear that this time it will not be a good recipe either.
As we look ahead to the 2023 session, Democratic lawmakers have said they'd like to address our state's problems with alcohol through new legislation. Now, in August, New Mexico In Depth put New Mexico's nation-leading alcohol-related death rate into the spotlight. If you haven't read it already, they've published an extensive 7-part series called Blind Drunk. Journalist Ted Alcorn focuses on the issue itself, drunk driving, alcohol's impact on violent crime, myths when it comes to who carries the burden of this problem, failings in our state's public policy, and the overarching issue of addiction and how it's treated. We brought in Mr. Alcorn and a panel of experts to talk through the various factors. Now, in this excerpt from that roundtable conversation, we explain the scope of the problem and potential solutions, including possible policy changes from the legislature as early as next year. Hello, everyone. We're joined by Ted Alcorn today. He's a writer and an independent journalist who did a great deal of work on this project. We also have Dr. Camilla Venner. She's an associate professor of clinical psychology at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Jenny Way, an internal medicine physician at Gallup Indian Medical Center, and State Representative Joanne Ferrari for Doña Ana County. Thank you all for joining us for this important discussion. We want to follow this very closely here at New Mexico PBS, and we thank you for your time today. Ted, let me start with you, of course. You wrote each article in a 7-part series, in case folks haven't not seen this yet, on alcohol use and misuse here in New Mexico. Can you start by explaining how this project came about, and why did you think this issue deserved this kind of coverage?
Well, about a year ago, New Mexico In Depth asked me to look into a story on alcohol. They had some suspicions that the mortality we were seeing for COVID was connected to alcohol use in the state. But it didn't take long for me to notice some of the basic factors that make alcohol really stand out. New Mexico has not only the highest rate of alcohol-related deaths in the country, we have the highest rate head and shoulders over every other state. And the more I learned, the more I felt like this sort of catastrophe that was happening in plain sight was the result of a lot of misconceptions that we have about how alcohol affects our population, what we can do about it. And so as the reporting went on, I spoke to more and more people and collected data. It felt like it needed a lot of space to grow. So in the end, as you said, it became a 7-part series, and I interviewed over 150 people for it. And, I think we came to some conclusions that surprised even me.
One of those conclusions, by the way, in the first in the series is brilliantly titled An Emergency Hiding in Plain Sight. Very apt title there. Kind of sets the stage with this issue we're facing in New Mexico. Let me ask you this. Through your research, you found drinking kills New Mexicans at a much higher rate than anywhere else in the country. The conclusion reached is that we've failed to address this crisis in part because we've misunderstood it. What's been the big misunderstanding in your research?
Well, there's been a few misunderstandings. I think the first one, growing up in Albuquerque in the 1990s, was that I was, both aware of the tremendous problem of DWI in our state, but also buffeted by the policy prescriptions that we were starting to put in place, because at that point, our state really made a collective and systematic and sustained effort to reduce DWI. And I think that has had numerous benefits. We brought down the rates of crash fatalities a lot, but we kind of missed the forest for the trees, because when you look at alcohol-related deaths nowadays, DWIs only account for about 1 in 10 of them. So 9 in 10 of alcohol-related deaths in the state are occurring elsewhere. We overlook the role that alcohol plays in violence. As it turns out, we have, of course, widespread shared concerns about having a safer state. Our elected officials are talking about it. What they don't often say is that 40% of people who died by homicide in the state died with alcohol in their blood, as did 30% of people who died by suicide. So alcohol is the most common intoxicant in violence in New Mexico. Those are the kind of blind spots, I think, that have kept us from addressing this issue head on.
Good points there. I'd like to bring in Dr. Jenny Way on this issue. Doctor, how should we approach this clearly life-threatening, issue, and what do we need to do to get a better understanding as New Mexicans about the depth of the problem?
A lot of people who struggle with alcohol use disorders also have comorbid mental health disorders, and it's important to treat all of those. And it's important to treat, I think what we say a lot in addiction medicine is that every door is the right door, whether it's through my primary care clinic, whether it's through when they get admitted to the hospital in the intensive care unit after a motor vehicle accident or broken bones, or whether it's through the emergency department. We need to make sure that in every possible door that people are entering, that there are treatment options available, that we offer them in the emergency department when they're admitted to the hospital here and when I see them in the primary care setting. I think too often as primary care doctors, we feel we treat the complications of alcohol use disorders like liver disease, like the broken bone that happened or the motor vehicle accident injuries. But we don't really treat the underlying cause of all of these problems in the first place, which of course is their alcohol use disorder. And given the extent of the problem, we cannot just put that on behavioral health specialists, psychiatrists. We as primary care providers need to be taking ownership of this as well, given how severely under-resourced our behavioral health departments are in the state. And so I very much believe that as a general internal medicine provider, family medicine provider, general surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, all of us need to be able to treat alcohol use disorders and not just rely on a non-existent behavioral health department that may not be able to get an appointment for many, many months.
If I may, I just wanted to put that in context too, because the state has looked at the scale of untreated substance use in the state. And we talk, of course, a lot about the state's struggles with opiates, fentanyl, methamphetamines, but alcohol is the biggest untreated substance use problem in New Mexico. There are 73,000 people who are estimated to have an alcohol disorder who aren't getting treated. And that's more than people with disorders for all other substances combined. So it shows that there's a big opportunity for the care that Dr. Way's mentioned. Reading
the series, it really struck me how screening by docs could be so impactful here. Why is this not really kind of taking root just a little bit with a little bit more vigor inside medical circles? I'm curious your opinion on that.
Well, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a clinical psychologist, but what my understanding, doctors have a lot to do in their 12 minutes or 15 minutes that they have with patients. So it can be, an issue of time. There's also an issue of training. Not a lot of training in medical school and residencies focus on addiction. For as much as it shows up in clinics, they don't get that much training. So I think there can be a self-efficacy piece where they're not really entirely sure what to do if the patient does screen positive. In a slight brief intervention in a compassionate way, to talk about, what are they thinking? Here's what we're seeing. What do you think about that? And having a nice conversation and having an open door, like Jenny Way says, every door is right. So I think there's a lot more we can do for training medical students and helping doctors feel, more self-efficacy like Dr. Way feels. So
I'd just like to add that, back in the 90s when we passed the major legislation to, combat DWI, we did consider the behavioral health problems of it too, but didn't really reach as far as we wanted to. But something that came out from them was to somehow incentivize doctors by every time that they do the SAMHSA screening, and make it so that we can incentivize them to go ahead and do that and help their patients.
Interesting. Representative, let me stay with you on this. I mean, obviously we had the awful news with the parade in Gallup with the injuries suffered by somebody who appeared to be impaired behind the wheel, and just an awful situation when the law enforcement approached the vehicle, it just took off. Does it make it harder when we have situations like that, or does it actually help move things along in a certain way? How do you see that as an elected representative?
Well, I know that Ted has been working on this series for a long time, since probably the beginning of the year at least. And like in the 90s, when we were starting to look at the overall package of DWI changes that we needed, the Cravens crash tragedy happened, and just as we were getting ready to go to the legislature, Nadine Milford and her husband Bob became advocates for the change that we needed. So I hope it brings the attention that we need to motivate what we should start, like the governor immediately setting up a task force with legislators and all of the experts such as Dr. Way and Ms. Bummer. And we need to make sure that we use scientific, evidence-based approaches again to revitalize not just DWI, the enforcement and helping the victims and preventing the consequences, but overall for alcohol-related deaths. And this is really important because I think, as Ted pointed out, that adverse childhood experiences are usually related to someone in the family for domestic violence, for child neglect and abuse. All of these different things seem to coalesce around the alcohol abuse, and we need to hit it head on.
Ted, I want to ask you about something that I think a lot of folks would find very interesting outside of political circles, and that is taxing alcohol and what it does to lessen the amount of drinking going on out there. If you would, in general terms, sort of lay out the framework of what that is and what you discovered in your research as well.
Well, historically, I think the public and lawmakers have often tended to think of alcohol taxes as a revenue raiser. In our state and in many other states, we impose a very small excise tax on alcohol. And when you break it down to the amount per standard drink, we're talking about a few pennies. But those pennies add up because we drink a lot, and it raises about $50 million a year for the state. But what many people have overlooked is the fact that the taxes really are also a tool of public policy because they affect the price of the alcohol that's sold. And it's pretty clear that when the state imposes a tax on these items, the distributors or wholesalers pass that tax on to consumers. And so it artificially makes the substance a little bit more expensive. And this is important because the basic economic principles of supply and demand say that when you raise taxes a little bit, you reduce demand some. And in this case, you particularly reduce demand by young people who don't have necessarily as much access to cash, and people that are really exposed to the price increases because they're consuming a lot of alcohol. And so the research has gone on over many years and in many states. And on my read of it all, it seemed pretty definitive that when you raise alcohol taxes, there's a reduction in consumption, and that you see a lot of reductions in the harms that alcohol can have. You see reductions in DWI. You see reductions in cirrhosis, some of the chronic conditions associated with alcohol. So, we know that this policy measure is effective. We see lawmakers really neglecting it, though. Over the last 30 years, not only have we left alcohol taxes at their same rate, we've allowed inflation to eat away at them because we tax alcohol. This is kind of subtle, but we tax alcohol by the volume that is sold, not by its price. So that means a $6 pack of Budweiser 20 years ago has the same tax on it as a $12 pack of Budweiser has today. So all told, we're kind of turning our back on one of the most important measures to addressing excessive alcohol use. And that's not only true in New Mexico, that's true across the country.
Representative,
Absolutely.
Please, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
That's all true, and especially to prevent underage drinking, because if the younger you are when you start to drink, the more likely you are to become a lifelong abuser of alcohol and see those effects. In 2017, we had a group that was trying to address that and raise the tax. I think it was $0.25 a drink. And we need to kind of change that a little bit and come back to trying to make it a percentage so that we don't have to have inflation or different things change the effectiveness of raising the tax and the deterrent effect that it has.
People might put a little bit too much emphasis on there being some kind of unique character trait to people that live there. Because they're not terribly different from anyone else in how they view life. People want their kids to go to school. People want to be able to enjoy their life and laugh and and be happy, and people are still getting married. But it's part of the reason that they've been so successful in fighting back is simply that they just don't want to die.
In Washington, our federal lawmakers are getting ready for a shakeup in the Congress. Republicans will have control of the House after gains during the midterms, but they fell short on their push to grab a hold of the Senate. That means chambers split across party lines and a strong possibility of partisan gridlock. It's something former U.S. Senator for New Mexico Jeff Bingaman knows a lot about. Mr. Bingaman has a new book called Breakdown: Lessons for a Congress in Crisis. And in it, he talks about the growing polarization in Washington and across the country. Here's senior producer Lou DeVizio.
I'm privileged to be joined today by one of New Mexico's foremost politicians in recent history, serving 4 years as New Mexico Attorney General, followed by 3 decades, 30 years in the U.S. Senate, including 5 as chair of the Senate Energy Committee. Senator Jeff Bingaman, thank you so much for being here.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Absolutely. You have a new book out now, and it's about as timely as you can get after the midterm elections. From a partisan standpoint, things tightening up in Washington. It's called Breakdowns: Lessons Learned for a Congress in Crisis. What is it about this moment that makes the message of this book so relevant right now?
Well, I think what makes it relevant is, first of all, you've got a divided government again in Washington, where the House will be controlled by Republicans. In the new Congress. It begins in January. And of course, the Democrats will continue to control the Senate and the White House. So in the past, that's not been a good recipe for making progress. And I fear that this time it will not be a good recipe either for making progress. And I try to point out in the book some of the things that went wrong during the time I was there that in my view went wrong that I think we'll see revisited and probably repeated in the next Congress.
A theme of the book is hyperpolarization. It's something we see around the country right now in the public, but also represented in Congress. What do you think has contributed to that?
Well, I think, of course, the Congress reflects what's going on in the country. But I think in addition to that, members of Congress face a series of obstacles or impediments to doing the public good or serving the public interest. And I think those have all gotten worse. Special interests have a bigger voice in what happens in Washington than they used to have. The pressure to toe the party line and to stick with your party and not do anything that would disagree with your party leadership, that pressure is greater than it ever was. The pressure to do what the polls say. We now have the ability to essentially poll any segment of the population to find out what they think on a subject, and there's pressure on politicians to do what the polls say. And then, of course, a lot of people come to Congress with a lot of ideology, and I think that gets in the way of practical solutions to problems. And frankly, the media has become a significant factor in reinforcing the polarization.
Now, when you see how polarization is portrayed from the media, when you're scrolling through social media, do you think that maybe the public isn't quite as divided as it seems to be? Are there a majority of people that just want things done?
I think a majority wants to tone down the drama and the conflict and work on the problems that affect them. Economic problems, they're worried about inflation, obviously, and all of us are worried about inflation. They're worried about the future prospect of a possible recession and whether that's actually going to happen or not. And they've got other concerns. They're trying to raise a family and deal with the real life problems that people encounter. So I think most people are in that category. Most people are not extreme in their politics. They are more interested in the results and whether or not people in Washington are working for them as they see it.
Now, you recently wrote an op-ed published by The Hill where you talk about some of the themes in your book, like we've talked about polarization, gridlock in Congress, but more specifically, you frame it through the lens of climate change legislation. This is something that you've dedicated a great portion of your career to, but before we get into the legislative issues that are surrounding climate action, I want to hammer down why, in your mind, you think it's such a vital issue for everyone, particularly in New Mexico.
Well, I think that anybody who pays attention knows that that extreme weather events are more frequent now than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and the scientists, I think, almost uniformly at this point, maybe uniformly, tell us that this is resulting from the warming of the climate, and that, of course, is being caused to a substantial extent by human activity, the use of fossil fuels, and the enormous amounts of greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere. So it's an issue that's, it's going to be with us, frankly, for the next umpteen decades. It's not one that you can just sort of fix and then go on to some other problem. But we need to be responsible to the extent we can, and we've done very little so far. We need to do much more to come to grips with the problem.
In that op-ed, you detailed a timeline of climate action, including a quote from President George H.W. Bush, of course a Republican in 1992, promising that the U.S. would, quote, be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment. Have we failed in that mission?
Well, I think we definitely have in recent years. I think President Obama tried very hard to fulfill that role with the Paris Accords that he championed and helped persuade people to sign up to and sign the U.S. up to. But then, of course, that was repudiated by President Trump. And so we've been off again, on again, and we don't seem to have a bipartisan consensus that the federal government needs to act responsibly to deal with the issue. So it's unfortunate. The Senate and the Congress passed an important piece of legislation to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions just in September, and I compliment them for that, but it's not enough. I think everyone there knows it's not enough, and unfortunately they passed it without any Republican support, which is too bad that they can't get Republicans to sign on to some of these initiatives to try to begin dealing with the problem.
I want to get to both of those things, actually, the Inflation Reduction Act and this lack of Republican support. That quote that I mentioned from George H.W. Bush, that's probably not the rhetoric that you're going to hear from Republican lawmakers in 2022.
No, I agree. There are very few that are now reflecting that attitude, that we need to be the leader in the world in dealing with climate change and maintaining the environment.
What pushed that seemingly ideological shift in the Republican Party away from even acknowledging environmental issues to a large extent?
Well, I think, unfortunately, and I talk about this fairly extensively in the book, I think special interests did an excellent job of casting doubt on the science, trying to persuade people that, this may or may not be happening, and if it is happening, human activity may or may not be the cause. So that general doubt, I think, was promoted, and then in 2009, 2010, in that period, when the Tea Party was coming to power and was flexing their muscles, I think they were persuaded by special interests to a large extent and politicians. They were persuaded that this was an overreach by the federal government. The federal government had no business in trying to deal with this problem. And so we basically lost our best opportunity to deal with it right then, and ever since it's sort of become Republican Party orthodoxy to believe that this is not something the federal government should take bold action to deal with, and that may explain why we could not get a single Republican to support the legislation that was contained in the Inflation Reduction Act that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
Now, you mentioned earlier the Inflation Reduction Act, and that was a milestone achievement for Congress while these lawmakers are contemplating everything you just brought up. As someone who's been involved in legislative negotiations, who deserves some credit for getting this package through with so much opposition, even within some of the moderate wing of the Democratic Party?
Well, I think Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader there in the Senate, deserves much of the credit. He negotiated this with Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and Joe deserves some credit as well. But I think Chuck was the one who would not give up on the idea that we can pass something here with 50 Democratic senators, and he just pursued it doggedly there for weeks, and eventually got something agreed to and got it passed.
Now, earlier we talked about, and throughout this whole conversation, hyperpolarization, but when you see the level of gridlock that we have, partly because of the filibuster, and we kind of talked about this before, but is there a disconnect between the gridlock and the partisanship that we see in Congress and the American public as a whole?
Well, I think there is. As I indicated before, I think most people in the country are not as polarized and politicized as the people they send to Washington. I think some of the extreme elements, particularly on the Republican side, I think they are very demanding of the people that they send to Washington, and accordingly, you've got people serving in the House and serving in the Senate who feel under great pressure to reflect those extreme positions, and that's unfortunate. I think things like ranked choice voting, which is now being adopted, and we have it in Santa Fe. I think they've adopted it in Alaska, and various states are doing that. I think that would help a lot, because it essentially makes you, as a member of Congress or as a candidate, it makes you worry about what does the entire group that could vote for me, what do they prefer? If you take too extreme a position, you're not going to do well in a ranked choice voting kind of a setup. So there are some ideas out there for reducing this polarization, reducing this extremism.
Senator Jeff Bingaman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
International support for Ukraine is holding strong as dozens of countries and organizations have pledged more than 1 billion euros in aid to keep Ukrainians powered, fed, and warm during the winter. That's as the Biden administration is poised to approve sending a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine to help shoot down incoming Russian missiles. Now, we've been following the Russian invasion since it began in February. We spoke to Ukrainian citizens here in New Mexico, and since, we've been in contact with a journalist and filmmaker who's been on the front lines. Patrick Hillsman has covered military conflicts for years and has family here in New Mexico. Senior producer Lou DeVizio was lucky enough to sit down with him on a recent stop in Albuquerque to talk about the horrors and the triumphs he's witnessed during his time covering the war.
Joining me today in studio is Patrick Hillsman. He's an independent filmmaker and journalist who spent the last several months in Ukraine. Thanks for speaking with us today, Patrick. First, why Ukraine? I know you've worked in areas of conflict before as a frontline journalist. What about this situation pushed you to go and document what was happening there?
I felt something of an obligation because I had been covering a lot of wars that Russia specifically has been involved in, and I've written a lot of open source investigative pieces about Russian weaponry, and the fact that there was a large war that was involving some of the topics that I'd previously covered, And also one of my best friends is a Lebanese Ukrainian who I met about a decade ago back when I was covering Syria. And as the invasion kicked off, he was just chronicling the story of his village, which was being surrounded by Russian forces. Thankfully, they never made it in, but they were approximately 2 kilometers from his house. And the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers were actually firing at each other over his home. And he suggested that I come visit him and do some journalism. And I stayed in Lviv, which is to the west, and also traveled across the country to Zaporozhye, Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, which is in Donbass, Ternopil.
How did Ukraine compare to being the other wartime scenarios that you've been in, that you mentioned Syria?
The major difference was that in Syria, one side had absolute overwhelming firepower, and the other side essentially had almost no firepower. The fact that the Ukrainians have stuff like early warning systems, advanced satellite technology that the Americans have provided them, has made a huge difference. Just having a warning of a few minutes is the difference between soldiers getting blown up in an airstrike and being able to take shelter and surviving. I witnessed things like that, where the technological edge that the Ukrainian forces have in some circumstances saves lives. And that's a massive difference. Whereas in Syria, the regime forces would simply encircle cities and just blow them to smithereens. They've flattened cities as well in Ukraine, but the difference is that it's come at a terrible cost for them to do that. Whereas in Syria, they were able to do it with relatively few casualties and thus no consequences.
Your piece, Comedy at War, that you shared with us, featuring Valaria, what made you want to follow a comedian, of all people, in a wartime scenario?
In a war, the kind of gallows humor that people have really says a lot about the conditions that they're in and what they need to get through the day. And what I felt was compelling about her was that she was an internally displaced person from the city of Kharkiv, which is a majority Russian-speaking city in eastern Ukraine, which has been viciously targeted by the Russian forces, which is in itself quite ironic because a large number of the victims of Putin's aggression have been the Russian speakers of Ukraine. And this runs counter to the propaganda that they've put out saying that they're liberating the Russian-speaking population. Of course, the president is Russian-speaking. The experience that she described to us is absolutely harrowing because part of what makes it so stressful for people to leave home is that as they left, they didn't even know where they would end up because the trains had to take the safest route to the west. So sometimes that would mean that they would end up in Ternopil or they'd end up in Lviv or elsewhere. And to have a country which in many ways looks like my country. You go into, they don't have Starbucks, but you can go into a coffee house, which is the equivalent of Starbucks. They have contactless payment. Everything appears as it would in America in a lot of ways. But then a few kilometers away, there's the second largest army in the world invading. And it was interesting to learn how people are really stubbornly insisting on clinging to daily life. And in Kharkiv, for example, there is constant shelling. There have been a horrible number of civilian casualties, yet the subway still runs. And having the subway operational, despite shelling, despite bombing, despite Russian forces literally trying to encircle the city at a certain point, is very, it's inspiring, and it shows a certain amount of stubbornness to insist on continuing daily life. And I think that she, going on stage, making jokes about the war, which has robbed her of her home and of her career for the time being, was definitely something that we could all learn from.
Sure. You mentioned that stubbornness, and we've heard examples of that from other people that we've talked to from Ukraine who are here in New Mexico and just watching news stories. But how much do you think that plays into the relative success that Ukraine has had holding off the Russians?
I think that people might put a little bit too much emphasis on there being some kind of unique character trait to people that live there.
Okay.
Because they're not terribly different from anyone else in how they view life. People want their kids to go to school, people want to be able to enjoy their life and laugh and be happy, and people are still getting married. But it's part of the reason that they've been so successful in fighting back is simply that they just don't want to die. They've seen what's happened in cities like Mariupol, and it's an apocalypse. So the idea of banding together to try to resist that is not, it doesn't necessarily take a unique outlook or a unique stubbornness to be willing to resist. It's just people's insistence on living is really what their secret weapon is, I think.
Now, you're back here in New Mexico where your parents live. And coming back, what do you want people to know here in the US, but here in New Mexico also, about what's happening in Ukraine?
I want people to know that the propaganda that's being put forward about it being some kind of country that's oppressive to Russian speakers is laughable. President is a Russian speaker. The cities that are suffering the most from Russian bombardment are majority Russian speaking. A lot of the times if you go out on the front lines, the soldiers will be speaking in Russian. And it's in some parts of the country, it's unusual to hear Ukrainian spoken. And that is the pillar of Putin's propaganda, is the notion that he's liberating the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. And it's just false, because the Russian-speaking cities have been just viciously targeted. And I think that it's important for people to understand that that is not true. That is not a truthful message that's coming from Russia. Secondly, Ukraine needs aid, period. There's a huge lack of some basic supplies. Fuel is almost impossible to come by. It's rationed. And for people to be able to live normally, they need vehicles, because Ukraine is a gigantic country. So traveling between cities now that air travel is grounded is incredibly difficult. It can, you can be in a car for 24 hours sometimes, and you just have to get used to living in cars in order to travel anywhere. And things like solar energy, hybrid vehicles, cars with better gas mileage, basic medical equipment, things that people are not thinking of very much in the media or in public consciousness are needed out there. For example, there's a lot of volunteers that are going over there to fight, right? Ukraine has a large army, and it has a lot of manpower. What would probably be more helpful for them would be experienced drivers or medics or people that are good at operating drones, people that are good at repairing vehicles, people that are good at software. There's a need for everything now. And we just look at the military side, but Ukraine's success so far has as much to do with them insisting on keeping civil society active as it does on the military aspect. Actually, one of the first things I said when I got there was that I said, I think Ukraine might actually be successful in this war. And my friend said, why? And I said, because I just paid for a soda at a gas station with a credit card, and it still works. A lot of the areas around Kyiv that were devastated by the Russian bombardment, you can go there now and they're repairing them. I was headed east once, and I remember there was a destroyed bridge, and we had to sort of drive down by the riverbed to a smaller bridge that had been built to try and to compensate for the fact that the bridge was blown up. And then a couple weeks later, when we came back, there was a new bridge there. And I said, this was blown up last time we were here, right? And it was repaired. So you see people fixing things under bombardment. That's extraordinary. And if you want to talk about what is contributing to them being able to at least fight for their independence, I think it has a lot to do with that. It's not just soldiers, it's everybody.
For the next few weeks here at NMPBS, we're going to be looking ahead to 2023. Now, next week on our show, our land senior producer Laura Paskus recaps a historic year for the environment here in New Mexico. Laura speaks with experts about last year's record-setting fire season and asks if we could see a similar situation next year. Plus, she checks in on our state's water supply as we get set for another dry spring. That's all next week on New Mexico in Focus. Then, Friday, December 30th, we're shifting our attention to the Roundhouse. I'll talk with a panel of political insiders about the potential issues that could come up in the legislative session starting in January. And we'll hear from the nominee to become the next Speaker of the House. Correspondent Russell Contreras sits down with Representative Javier Martinez to ask about his vision for the legislature. Don't miss our session preview show on Friday, December 30th, on NMPBS. For now, thanks again for joining us and for staying informed and engaged. We'll see you again next week in Focus.
Funding for New Mexico in Focus provided by the viewers like you.